Millionaire marries a girl in a coma. For grandfather's will, what happened next stunned everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The cold autumn rain drummed against the windows of the towering city hospital. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above a stark, sterile corridor. Nurses walked briskly past with clipboards, and machines beeped in rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat. Behind one closed door, a young woman lay motionless. Her long dark hair fanned across the pillow, her skin pale as porcelain. She had been in a coma for months after a car accident that had stolen her voice, her laughter, and the simple routine of her everyday life. Her name was Emily Carter, a girl from an ordinary family who had always dreamed small but loved big. At the same time, across the city, luxury glistened in another world entirely. A crystal chandelier blazed above an oak conference table. Lawyers, relatives, and board members leaned forward as the will of the late patriarch, Harold Sinclair, was read aloud. Harold Sinclair was the legendary founder of Sinclair Enterprises, a man whose wealth stretched across continents and whose reputation was feared in every boardroom. His passing had left a massive inheritance, but his words from the grave carried one last condition. My grandson, Alexander Sinclair, shall inherit my estate only if he is married within 30 days of my death. The room erupted in whispers. Faces turned toward Alexander, the only heir. He sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his tailored suit impeccable. But behind the sharp lines of his features was fury. Marriage? To him, love had always been nothing more than a transaction, and relationships were weaknesses disguised as promises. Now his grandfather was binding his fortune to a vow Alexander had never wanted to make. He left the conference room without a word, his shoes striking the marble floor with clipped precision. Outside, in the shadows of the rain, he muttered to himself. Marriage. A leash disguised as loyalty. Yet, time was not his ally. 30 days would vanish like smoke, and if he failed, everything the company, the empire, the legacy, would fall into the hands of greedy relatives who were already circling like vultures. He needed a solution, one that required no emotions, no risks, and no messy entanglements. A marriage of convenience, a name on paper, nothing more. But fate, cruel and cunning, had already set its stage. For in that sterile hospital room, beneath the quiet hum of machines, lay the perfect candidate for a silent contract. A girl with no voice to object, no family strong enough to resist the temptation of financial aid, and no consciousness to demand love in return. Emily Carter. And so, Alexander's path collided with hers, not through destiny's romance, but through a contract written in desperation. What neither of them knew was that this cold decision, born from greed and inheritance, would unravel into something that stunned everyone, including Alexander himself. The days after the will was read moved with the weight of inevitability. Alexander Sinclair had built a reputation as a ruthless businessman, someone who made decisions with the precision of a scalpel and the coldness of steel. But even he knew that the eyes of the world were watching. Every shareholder, every relative, and every newspaper headline waited to see if he would bend to his grandfather's demand. He could not afford hesitation. So, in the span of 1 week, Alexander orchestrated what would become one of the strangest weddings the city had ever seen. No flowers lined the aisle, no laughter filled the air, and no music played except the sterile hum of hospital machinery. The bride wore a simple hospital gown instead of white satin. Her hands, pale and still, rested on the blanket. Tubes and monitors surrounded her bed like silent witnesses. The justice of the peace, hired in secret, cleared his throat nervously. Do you, Alexander Sinclair, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health? Alexander's voice was calm, steady, and without emotion. I do. The words fell like stones into the silence. The justice turned to the unconscious girl, hesitating. Alexander's lawyer stepped forward, presenting a folder filled with medical authorizations and family consent forms. Every detail had been handled, every loophole closed. With a reluctant nod, the justice continued. The moment came for the bride's vow. Emily Carter, still lost in her coma, could not speak. Her breathing machine hissed softly, filling the void where her voice should have been. A nurse signed her name on the register, a hand guided by guardianship documents that Emily's weary family had agreed to under pressure. To them, Alexander's offer had seemed like a lifeline funding for her medical care. Bills paid, security promised. When the justice of the peace declared them husband and wife, Alexander did not smile. There was no kiss, no celebration, no warmth. Only the cold rustle of paper as signatures were completed. The witnesses, his lawyer, 2 hospital staff, and a board member looked on with unease, as if they were present, not at a wedding, but at the signing of a business deal. After the ceremony, Alexander stood by the bedside, studying her face. She looked fragile, untouched by the chaos that surrounded her. For a fleeting second, his chest tightened with something he could not name, but he quickly buried it beneath his armor of logic. This was not a love story. This was strategy. She was not a wife. She was a contract. The media did not know the details yet, but whispers spread quickly. Photos of Alexander leaving the hospital in a tailored black suit surfaced online. The headlines wrote themselves. Millionaire Sinclair marries in secret. Mystery bride unseen. The public speculated wildly. Some thought it a scandal, others a romantic secret. No one knew the truth, and Alexander planned to keep it that way. That night, he returned to the penthouse, the city lights burning beneath him like 1,000 tiny judgments. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window. His reflection in the glass was sharp, composed, and victorious. Yet in the silence of his empty home, the echo of his grandfather's voice haunted him. Marriage is not a contract, Alexander. It is a choice. One day, you will understand. Alexander dismissed the memory with a bitter laugh. For him, this marriage was nothing more than a means to an end. What he did not know was that destiny had already written a very different outcome, one that would begin the moment Emily Carter opened her eyes. The weeks passed in silence, marked only by the steady rhythm of machines and the quiet footsteps of nurses. Alexander rarely visited after the wedding. To him, the matter was settled. He had fulfilled the condition. He had secured the inheritance. All that was left was to wait until the required time passed and then file for a quiet annulment. But fate, unpredictable and relentless, had other plans. One gray morning, a nurse entered Emily's room to check her vitals. She froze when she saw the faintest flutter of eyelids. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a wishful mistake. But then the flutter grew into a struggle, and suddenly, Emily's eyes opened. Confusion filled them, wild and searching. The monitors spiked. The nurse gasped and called for the doctor. Within minutes, the room filled with medical staff. After months of stillness, Emily Carter had returned to the world of the living. Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but she forced out a single question. Where am I? The doctors explained gently, and her family rushed to her side, tears streaming. But joy soon tangled with confusion when Emily noticed something odd. On the bedside table, among the flowers and cards, lay a framed document with a gold seal. Her name, a signature. Words she did not remember agreeing to. Marriage certificate, the doctor muttered, trying to remove it quickly. But Emily had already seen, her brows furrowed. Marriage? To who? The family avoided her gaze. The truth was too heavy to deliver in the fragile moment of her return. But the silence was answer enough. A seed of unease rooted itself in her chest. Later that evening, Alexander arrived at the hospital. He entered the room with his usual calm authority, but for the first time, her eyes met his. Alive, sharp, demanding answers. You, she whispered, her voice still hoarse from months of disuse. Are you my husband? The room went still. Even Alexander, who prided himself on control, hesitated. For a heartbeat, his armor cracked. But then he straightened, adjusting his cufflinks, and spoke with measured clarity. Yes, by law and by contract, I am. Emily's eyes widened. By contract? Her fragile body trembled with indignation. Memories of her simple life before the accident flooded back the bookstore where she had worked. The laughter of her younger brother, the modest apartment filled with dreams. None of those memories included this man, this stranger who now claimed her as his wife. "I did not choose this," she whispered, her voice breaking. Alexander's jaw tightened. He could have lied, could have painted the story as fate, but something in her gaze forced honesty. "No, you did not. This marriage was necessary. For my inheritance, you were convenient." The words cut deeper than any wound. Emily turned her face away, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For the first time since she had awakened, she wished she had not. Alexander watched her, his chest heavy with a strange, uninvited discomfort. He told himself it was irrelevant. She would recover. The contract would stand. The world would move on. But deep inside, something had shifted. For the first time in his life, Alexander Sinclair felt the sharp sting of guilt. And Emily Carter, trapped in a marriage she never agreed to, vowed silently that she would uncover the truth behind every signature, every paper, and every lie that had bound her to this man. This was no love story. Not yet. It was a battlefield waiting to ignite. The days that followed Emily's awakening were anything but peaceful. After the initial shock wore off, reality pressed down like a storm. Doctors advised rest and rehabilitation. But Emily's mind refused to stay still. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander's face and heard his cold words echoing. "You were convenient." When she was discharged from the hospital, Alexander insisted she come to his penthouse. Her modest apartment had been left unpaid during her coma, her family buried in medical debt. Against her protests, she was carried into a world she had never imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the glittering skyline, marble floors that echoed with every step, chandeliers worth more than her entire neighborhood. She felt suffocated. "This is not a home," she whispered to herself. "It is a museum." Alexander, ever composed, watched her explore with suspicion. He had expected gratitude, maybe awe. Instead, she recoiled from the silk sheets, the expensive wine, the designer dresses laid out for her. She asked for a simple cotton blanket, tea instead of champagne, and a notebook instead of jewelry. The clash of their worlds grew sharper with each passing day. At breakfast, she preferred oatmeal and fresh fruit, while he demanded imported coffee and gourmet dishes prepared by a chef. When she suggested donating untouched food to a shelter, he frowned. "This is not a charity, Emily. This is how people of my status live." Her eyes flashed with quiet defiance. "Then maybe your status is the problem." Even the smallest routines revealed the vast canyon between them. Emily liked to sit by the window and sketch the street below, capturing ordinary people walking to work, holding hands, laughing. Alexander dismissed it as a waste of time. Art does not pay bills. Efficiency does. But what he did not understand was that for Emily, those sketches were a lifeline. Each pencil line reminded her of the world she had lost, the world where kindness mattered more than profit. Their arguments simmered. Some ended in silence, others in sharp words that hung in the air long after they stopped speaking. Yet beneath the friction, something unspoken lingered. Alexander found himself pausing at the doorway, watching her hum softly as she drew. He found himself replaying her words when she spoke about dignity and compassion. For the first time, someone dared to challenge his worldview, and he could not simply brush it aside. One evening, a confrontation broke open like thunder. Emily had discovered a charity project that Harold Sinclair had left unfinished, a foundation meant to fund schools in struggling neighborhoods. She insisted they revive it. Alexander shook his head. "Those were my grandfather's sentimental ideas. He ran a corporation, not a shelter. That is not our responsibility." Emily stood tall, her voice trembling but firm. "Maybe that is why he added the marriage clause. Maybe he wanted you to learn that power means nothing if it is not used to lift others. If you cannot see that, then perhaps you do not deserve his legacy at all." The words struck deeper than she knew. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He walked away, retreating into silence. Yet her challenge echoed louder than any boardroom debate he had ever faced. For Emily, the penthouse was a gilded cage. For Alexander, her presence was a mirror, forcing him to see parts of himself he had long buried. Their lives had collided. not with gentle compromise, but with sparks that threatened to ignite into a fire neither could control. And beneath that fire lay the question neither dared to ask aloud. Could two worlds so opposite ever find a way to exist together? The tension between Emily and Alexander lingered like a storm cloud. Their words often clashed, their silences carried unspoken resentment. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, small cracks began to form in the walls they had built around themselves. It started with a routine doctor's appointment. Alexander had intended to send his driver, but at the last moment, he appeared at the hospital himself. He stood by Emily's side during her checkup, his tall frame awkward in the cramped examination room. When the doctor explained her progress and encouraged light physical therapy, Alexander listened intently. He asked questions, practical ones about schedules and recovery, but his presence was steady. For the first time, Emily felt a flicker of support rather than control. Later that week, Emily ventured into the kitchen, tired of endless gourmet meals that felt like theater rather than nourishment. She tied her hair back and prepared a simple chicken soup, seasoned with care rather than extravagance. The scent filled the penthouse, warm and familiar. Alexander, returning late from a meeting, stopped in the doorway. The scene was so foreign to him, home-cooked food in a place that had never known it, that he simply stared. She noticed him and raised an eyebrow. "Do you want to taste it, or will you just stand there like a statue?" Against his own instinct, Alexander sat at the table. The first spoonful startled him. It was not extraordinary, not exotic, but it was real. It tasted like comfort, like something his grandfather had once spoken of, but he had long dismissed. Without realizing it, he finished the bowl. Emily smirked softly. So, the great Alexander Sinclair can enjoy ordinary food after all. He did not answer, but the ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. As days slipped by, these moments multiplied. Emily discovered that Alexander kept his grandfather's old journal locked away in his study. Late one night, she found him reading it, his usually composed face softened by nostalgia. When he noticed her, he quickly closed it, but not before she glimpsed the handwritten lines about kindness and legacy. "You miss him," she said quietly. Alexander's voice was low. "He expected too much of me. Or maybe he believed you were capable of more than you think," Emily replied. Their conversations, once sharp with conflict, began to stretch into quieter tones. They spoke about books she had loved, places he had traveled, and the differences in how they viewed the world. At times, they still disagreed, but the edges were no longer knives. One evening, she convinced him to join her on a short walk in the park near the penthouse. The city lights glowed around them, and autumn leaves scattered under their steps. Alexander walked stiffly at first, out of place without the armor of his suit and office. But as Emily laughed at children chasing each other near the fountain, his expression softened. He found himself watching her more than the scenery. The way her eyes lit up at simple joys unsettled him. He had lived surrounded by wealth, yet she found beauty in fallen leaves and ordinary laughter. Back in the penthouse, Emily returned to her sketches. This time, Alexander lingered nearby instead of dismissing them. He picked up one of her drawings, a street vendor handing food to a homeless man. The pencil lines were rough, but the warmth in the gesture was undeniable. "You see things others overlook," he admitted. "And you avoid seeing things that might change you," she answered gently. For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. Not hostile, not heavy, just present. Something neither of them could name had begun to take root. It was not love, not yet. But it was no longer pure resentment either. It was a fragile harmony, an unexpected closeness that neither had planned for, born from shared moments that slipped past their defenses. And though Alexander would never say it aloud, he realized with quiet unease that Emily Carter was no longer just a contract. The fragile harmony between Emily and Alexander did not last long. Like glass resting on the edge of a table, it only took one push for everything to shatter. It began with whispers in the media. A tabloid headline screamed across the city. "Sinclair marriage a business deal? Sources claim bride was in coma." The words spread like wildfire. News anchors debated it on television. Online articles dissected every detail, and strangers on social media judged without hesitation. Emily first saw it on a television in the penthouse lobby. She froze, her heart racing as the anchor spoke her name. According to leaked documents, Emily Carter was in a coma at the time of her wedding to Alexander Sinclair. Critics call it a sham marriage designed solely to secure his inheritance. The world spun. Her hands trembled as she turned toward Alexander, who had just stepped out of the elevator. His expression gave him away he already knew. "You knew this would happen," she whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened. "It does not matter what the press says. They thrive on scandal. This will fade." But it did not fade. By evening, reporters swarmed outside the building. Headlines grew sharper. Gold digger in a hospital bed. Sinclair exploits unconscious bride. The cruelty was relentless. And Emily was at the center of it all. In the penthouse, she confronted him. Her voice shook with rage and heartbreak. "They are calling me a parasite, Alexander. They are saying I trapped you, that I married you for money. But I did not even know I was married until I woke up. How could you let this happen?" He tried to remain calm, but guilt flickered in his eyes. "I never intended for you to be humiliated. I did what was necessary. The inheritance, the company." "The company?" She cut him off, her voice rising. "You sacrificed my dignity for your empire. You did not see me as a person, only as a loophole." Her words sliced deeper than any headline. Alexander, who had always believed control was his greatest strength, suddenly found himself defenseless. Emily gathered her things, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. "I cannot stay here, not when the world thinks I am your accomplice in this lie." She walked toward the door. For the first time in his life, Alexander reached out not to command, but to plead. His hand hovered near hers, trembling. "Emily, please, do not leave like this." She turned, tears brimming in her eyes. "You chose money over truth. You chose power over me. I will not be part of your deception." With that, she was gone. The door closed behind her, leaving Alexander alone in the cavernous penthouse. The silence was deafening. Outside, the city buzzed with scandal, but inside, Alexander felt the sharp weight of something he had never known before: regret. He stared at the empty space where she had stood, the words of his grandfather echoing in his mind once more. "Marriage is not a contract, Alexander. It is a choice." For the first time, he understood what those words meant. And for the first time, he feared he had lost something far greater than any inheritance. The days after Emily left were some of the longest Alexander had ever known. His penthouse, once a symbol of power and status, now felt hollow. The silence pressed in on him like an accusation. Every empty chair reminded him of her laughter that had briefly filled the space. Every untouched sketch left behind reminded him of the warmth he had refused to embrace. But the world outside was not silent. The Sinclair board of directors convened an emergency meeting. The leaked scandal had shaken investor confidence, and rivals circled like wolves. In the gleaming boardroom, the chairman spoke with cold precision. "Alexander, this marriage has become a liability. The media storm is eroding the company's reputation. If you file for annulment immediately, we can contain the damage. You will retain control of the inheritance, and the press will eventually move on." Every head in the room nodded in agreement. To them, Emily was nothing more than an obstacle, a misstep to be erased. Alexander sat in silence, his fingers steepled under his chin. Annulment meant security. It meant the empire would remain intact. It meant the scandal would shrink into yesterday's headlines. And yet, the image of Emily's tear-filled eyes haunted him. The memory of her words cut deeper than the board's threats. "You chose money over truth. You chose power over me." For the first time, Alexander found himself cornered not by competitors, but by his own conscience. That night, he stood before the massive portrait of his grandfather that hung in the Sinclair estate. The stern eyes of Harold Sinclair seemed to pierce through him. "Marriage is not a contract, Alexander. It is a choice," he whispered into the empty hall. "I finally understand, grandfather, but I may have learned too late." The next morning, reporters gathered outside Sinclair Tower, expecting a statement about the annulment. Instead, Alexander walked to the podium himself. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, the air thick with anticipation. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, carried a rare weight of vulnerability. Yes, it is true. I married Emily Carter while she was in a coma. At the time, I did it to fulfill the terms of my grandfather's will. I will not deny it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The admission was bold, unprecedented. But Alexander did not stop there. What began as a contract has changed me in ways I could not foresee. Emily Carter is not a loophole. She is not a pawn. She is the reason I have realized that wealth without honor is nothing but a hollow shell. If this costs me the company, so be it. I would rather lose an empire than lose her dignity. The board erupted in outrage behind the scenes. Investors panicked. But for once, Alexander did not care. His words were not a strategy. They were truth. Across the city, in a small apartment lent by a friend, Emily watched the broadcast on television. She sat frozen, her hand over her mouth, as Alexander stood before the world and chose her honor over his empire. Her heart pounded, torn between disbelief and the stirring of something she thought she had buried. For the first time, she saw Alexander Sinclair not as the ruthless heir of an empire, but as a man standing on the edge of redemption. And for the first time, Alexander realized that love demanded the very thing he had always feared most: sacrifice. The fallout from Alexander's confession was immediate. News networks replayed his words on a loop, and the board of directors scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Yet the truth, once spoken, had a power of its own. Behind the scenes, a deeper revelation emerged. The leak that had exposed the Coma marriage was not an accident. Investigators traced it back to a rival within the company, a cousin desperate to seize control of the Sinclair empire. The same cousin had paid off hospital staff to provide false documents and fed the press with twisted narratives. When this evidence surfaced, the story shifted. What had begun as condemnation turned into outrage against the real conspirator. The media devoured the betrayal, and the cousin's name became a synonym for greed and treachery. But the world was still watching Alexander. Redemption required more than exposing a rival. It demanded a public act that could not be undone. A press conference was called in the grand ballroom of a hotel. Reporters packed the room, their cameras aimed at the stage. Alexander stood at the podium, not in his usual tailored armor, but in a simple dark suit. The spotlight was harsh, but his voice was steady. "I will not pretend that I am innocent," he began. "I made a choice that was cold and selfish. I used Emily Carter as a means to an end. For that, I offer no excuses. I offer only my apology." Gasps filled the room, but he continued. "What you must understand is this. Emily Carter is not my downfall. She is my redemption. Because of her, I finally see that legacy is not built on contracts or wealth, but on courage and truth. If I must step down from Sinclair Enterprises, then I will. If I must lose every dollar I inherited, then so be it. But I will not lose her again." At that moment, the ballroom doors opened. Emily entered, her steps hesitant but resolute. The crowd turned, cameras flashing wildly. She walked toward the stage, her eyes locked on his. Alexander's voice faltered for the first time. "Emily." She took the microphone, her hands trembling but her voice clear. "The world may see a scandal, but I see a man who chose to stand in the light instead of hiding in the shadows. I never agreed to this marriage, but today, I choose to stay." The crowd erupted, reporters shouting questions, cameras blinding them both. But in that chaos, Alexander reached for her hand. This time, it was not for show, not for inheritance, not for power. It was real. And for the first time, the world witnessed not a contract, but a confession of love that could not be undone. The weeks after the public confession brought change that neither Emily nor Alexander could have imagined. The board of directors, furious at his honesty, voted to strip Alexander of his position as chief executive officer. The empire he had once fought so ruthlessly to control slipped through his hands, but for the first time, he did not feel the weight of loss. Instead, he felt the strange lightness of freedom. Emily stood by his side, her presence steady as the storm faded into calm. The tabloids moved on to fresher scandals, and the world began to forget. But Alexander remembered every moment, because for him, the scandal had not destroyed his life, it had rebuilt it. One crisp spring morning, Alexander invited Emily to a quiet garden outside the city. It was not the lavish setting of his world, but a modest place filled with blooming flowers and the scent of fresh earth. There were no cameras, no reporters, no contracts. Only him, her, and the simple truth between them. He held out a small box. Inside was not a diamond worth millions, but a simple silver band that had once belonged to his grandfather. His voice was unsteady, vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. "Emily Carter, the first time I called you my wife, it was a lie. Today, I ask you to be my wife for real. No contracts, no conditions, only choice." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him. The man who had once been nothing but arrogance and ambition now stood before her stripped of everything but sincerity. She nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, this time, I choose you too." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time, they sealed their vows not with paper, but with love. Their story did not end in the boardroom or the glare of headlines, but in a quiet promise made under open skies. Together, they would honor Harold Sinclair's legacy, not by building empires of wealth, but by building lives of kindness and integrity. And so, the millionaire who once saw marriage as a contract learned that true love is never written in ink. It is written in action, in sacrifice, and in the courage to choose each other every single day.